In this video, we're going to look at creating a series of different pipe segments that can be interlocked together inside of Unity and used to make a larger assembly of pipes. We're going to start inside of Blender, but before we begin, I'm actually going to make some changes to Blender that are a little bit more convenient for me in my workflow. In the other videos, I pretty much use the default key layouts. However, in this case, there are certain tools that I really enjoy operating a bit different than how Blender normally does things. The Move, Rotate, and Scale tool over here, if you use the hotkeys of G, R, and S, will give you a mode where their pivot is about the view. That is something that works really well in orthographic views. However, when I'm dealing in the perspective view, which is 99% of the time while I'm 3D modeling, that doesn't really benefit me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click here, and I'm going to go to Change Shortcut, and I'm going to hit the G key. To see this, let's go to Add, Mesh, and just create a cube. Now if I select that cube and hit G, you'll notice my gizmo now appears, which allows me to select a particular axis and move along it. This is just how I like to work. I enjoy having a gizmo there that allows me to select the axes interactively with the mouse, as opposed to having a view-based pivot and then needing to use X, Y, or Z to constrain or shift in those corresponding buttons to do a planar constraint. I want to do the same thing with rotation. I'm going to right-click and go to Change Shortcut and hit R, and finally we'll do Scale as well. Blender's hotkeys are incredibly adaptive and malleable based upon what you're doing. This is only going to take effect for object mode. When you go to edit mode or other ones, you will need to do the same thing because to Blender, it's a different set of hotkeys. Now with that completed, we're not actually going to be using polygons for this. If you were making pipes, one thing you might consider doing is going to add and then possibly creating a cylinder, and then determining how many sides you would like that to be by manipulating the vertex count over here and so forth. That's a fine way to operate. However, I like a little bit more control, especially when I'm creating curves and bends with my pipes. So we're going to use something called a Bezier Curve. Go ahead and delete this object. Now one other thing I am going to change is how the 3D cursor works inside my scene. I actually really like the 3D cursor because it's not the pivot of an object you're manipulating, it's a free point in space. We're going to open up our menu on the side. We're going to take a look at View. What you're going to notice is there's a section down here called 3D Cursor. The great thing about this is, if for some reason you can't get it where you'd like it, you can always select these and then hit 0 and of course center it out. But you'll notice my orientation is very funny. And in fact, most of the time, the 3D cursor is going to orient itself to the view. With my workflow and being mostly in perspective and not in a quad view, which you can do by hitting Control Alt and Q, this isn't always what I want. So what we can do is change how the 3D cursor interacts with the world. That is, instead of taking on the camera's orientation, it can take on the orientation of the world or an object you happen to be working with. Let's go to Edit and then Preferences. Now we already saw that under the key map you can make a considerable number of changes. What we want to do is actually figure out what that shift right click is all about. So let's go to key binding and start typing that. Shift and then right mouse button. That's a little bit too specific. Let's just try right mouse and take a look at what we have. So here you'll notice we have 3D view, set 3D cursor. That's fine, that's what we expect. But we can actually open this up, and under many of these hotkeys, you get to specify the default functionality. And this is a lot of important stuff I find overlooked in those beginner videos on Blender, because many times you might be coming from a different application, whether that is an engine like Unity or maybe Maya, 3D Studio Max, or something else. If we go to 3D cursor, what we'll see is over here there's an orientation. This is probably set to something like view at first. And if we were to come over here and right click, you'll notice that the cursor orients to the view. That is how I'm looking, my Z forward vector, and its rotation gets these funny values on the side. Let's go back to Edit Preferences and go back to the key map. I'm going to change this, and it's up to you. Transform or geometry are usually fine. I'm going to set transform for right now. So now if I right click, you'll notice that my view's rotation is set to 0, 0, 0. And what I like about these settings is that as opposed to it orienting to the view, I have a consistent orientation for that 3D cursor that I can depend on. Let's get to creating the pipes. Go ahead and hit Shift A. Then we'll go down to Curve and we'll select Bezier. Here you'll notice, as always, our object is by default created where the 3D cursor is. However, don't worry about that. We can always select the object by clicking on it if it isn't already selected, going to Item, going to Location, and hitting 0. This will center that object at 0, 0, 0. Of course, we can now hit period if we want to interactively move to it. Now, the Bezier curve might be intimidating at first. Where are the polygons? Where are the faces and edges? Don't worry about that yet. What we want to do is get the general shape of our object, because we'll be able to create geometry from this. And the great thing about working with Bezier curves is it's much easier to get nice, flowing geometry, especially for pipes. I'm going to hit Tab, just like with geometry, to go into my edit mode. And here you can see the different geometry. You'll notice that if we select or mouse over any of these points, we'll be able to select them. The points of a Bezier curve, that is the first and second point, that are visible are the start and end point. You can always reliably know that the Bezier curve is going to begin and end at one of those points. What's interesting about a Bezier curve is it's just another form of interpolation. However, you end up with these tangent handles. These handles allow you to modify how the curve is going to act between these 2 points, which gives you a lot more control. If we go ahead and hit G like before, you'll notice I now have a gizmo, which means I can easily select this curve and manipulate it how I see fit. Since we're using a Bezier curve, I would like to create a bent elbow joint, a 90-degree bend. So looking at this from above, or if you would like to, we can click Z here to get a top-down view. What I want to do is, I want to try to stay on some sort of a grid. So let's hit Shift-Tab to go to Snap Mode, click up here, and I'll choose Increment. And I almost always use Absolute Grid Snap, just because it, in my brain, makes more sense to do that. I want to click on this object, and I'm going to hit the G key now to move, and I'm going to move this down. And you'll notice it's snapping to the grid. I'm going to select this one as well, and it will snap to the grid. What I'm trying to do is have one point at one reliable place, and the other point at another one. This point, as we can see here, control point, is at 1. This one down here is at -1, -1. Let's move this one up so that it's at 1, 1, and this one's at -1, -1. Now I'm going to grab this handle, and we're going to move this up and move this over so that it goes from this point to the other point in a smooth 90-degree bend. We don't need to do anything to this point because it already has everything there by default. We can extend a point by hitting E for extrude or right-clicking and going to Extrude, Curve, and Move. Now you'll see we have another curve, and I'm just going to move that a little bit further, maybe 1 unit past this. I'm going to do the same thing here, except this time I'll hit E on the keyboard, and we'll move this down to that point right there. But where's our geometry? Well, we need to invoke that. The way we do that is by coming over into our Properties panel. We're going to open up the Object Data, and we're going to go down to Geometry. There's a lot of settings, but the one we really want is under Bevel. Under Depth, if we increase the size, you'll notice that we get a pipe generated. I'm going to select a convenient number, such as 1. Now, 1's pretty large, it's a very large diameter pipe, so maybe we'll choose something else, maybe 0.5 instead. Now what I want to do is make notes to myself that let me know what the size of the pipes I'm working with, the diameter of them. What we're going to say is that I'm going to say my diameter for all the pipes is going to be equal to 0.5 units. Just record that for future reference, because when we make the other pieces of pipe, we're going to want them to snap together easily. Now this is not yet a polygonal object. If you attempt to select this object or hit Tab, you'll notice that you're still messing with the Bezier surface. We're going to need to convert this. But before I do that, I'm actually going to turn on wireframe mode, because I want to see how it's going to be converted. This preview is going to give us information about how it's going to end up being converted into a polygonal object. Right now, you'll see my resolution is set to 4, and as we change these values, you'll notice that the number of segments increases and decreases. Hit Ctrl-Alt-Q, or use this little gizmo up here in order to see from a side view. So here we see that our resolution is 6. That is giving us 16 sides. If we come up here at the top, we'll see that resolution preview in the U direction is 12. If we interactively change this value, you'll see that we get more segments or fewer segments. For right now, we're going for a lower poly model, so I'm going to keep this maybe somewhere around that. Remember, this is a background element unless your game is about pipes, in which case you may want to put more segments. But what I am going to do is take a look at this and just make sure that I have a good amount of detail somewhat equally arranged throughout the object. Now you'll notice there is a little bit of difference up here and down here in terms of how things are being generated, but I'm really not concerned with it too much. I'm going to come down here and just take another look, and then of course we see our resolution. And this is an important one, because this is ultimately going to define how much of a circle the pipe is. What I really would like to do is either determine whether or not I want to have a vertex at the top and the sides, or if I want to have a flat face. For instance, if I reduce the number to 3 in this case, you'll notice the top and bottom are now flat. Depending upon what kinds of things you want to extrude or bring out into the object, A lot of times, it's easier to work with a flat face than it is with a vertex face and vice versa. Now for right now, I think I'm going to leave this at 5 gives me a flat face on the top. What about 4? 4 is pretty good. This is a good compromise, I think, for the moment. Let's go ahead and get out of X-ray mode. Now what we're going to do is convert this. I'm going to hit Tab so I have the Bezier curve selected. I'm going to go to Object, and we're going to go down to Convert To. We want to select Mesh from Curve, and you will have now created a mesh object from that curve. Now that we have our piece of pipe, we can start adding additional interesting detail. I'm going to hit Tab in order to go into Edit mode. I'm going to hit 3 because I'll be working with faces. And typically, when you deal with a pipe, you're going to have different segments of different thickness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to click near this edge, and that will select the entire ring around the object. If I were to select closer to a different edge, you'll notice that I select along this one. It's very easy when you're first starting off to make the wrong kinds of selections. So be aware of where your mouse is and where you're selecting. If you would like to grab additional parts, hold down the Shift button as you hold Alt. So if I click and hold down Alt, make my first selection, then Shift, we can make this a thicker selection. Now that I have this, I can right-click and start adding some information. I'm going to go to Extrude Faces Along Normals. And here you can see I can choose some sort of a offset. Because I'm making several different pieces and I want them to line up well and be consistent, this is a number I'm going to write down. I'm going to make this 0.125. Enter, and write that down over here. We can take our time and make this look a little interesting. I'll go ahead and make another extrusion, maybe something like this. This one isn't going to snap to anything necessarily. It is more about detail, so I'm not going to waste my time recording that information. Now once again, you're going to have to think about the future of your object. Is this object going to snap into other objects, or is it the one that other objects are snapping into? For right now, I'm going to leave this one exposed as it is. What you'll see with other objects is I will go in here and I'll actually select the ends like this, and I'll right click, we'll extrude, I'll choose the amount that we decided before, 0.125, and this will end up being a cap that can insert into other pieces of pipe. And actually, since I've already gone ahead and done it, I might as well just keep that. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit of bevels. So let's go back to Edit mode, and let's go to 2, and hold down Alt, and select these by also holding Shift. I'm going to grab all of these right now. There we are. Now that I have those, I'm going to right click and choose Bevel Edges. And I will interactively slide this to something like that. And I will middle mouse up to increase the number of divisions. 1 is good, 2's a lot, but really I think I'm just going to go with 1 because this is meant to be used extensively and I don't want my poly count to be too high. So now I have my pipe object. And the normals are a little wonky. So let's go ahead and hit Object, Shade Smooth. Then I'm going to go down to Normals, choose Auto Smooth, and dial this up to, well, a value that looks right. Probably somewhere between 45 and 50-ish. So now we'll see we have our hard edge here, but we have a nice smooth edge on these clamping pieces. Now you might wonder, should you cap this off or should you leave it open? Well, it's really up to you and your intent behind this object. If you want to make this a little bit more versatile, what you might do is, so you can go ahead and hold down Alt, click here, right click, and we might want to cap that off by selecting Fill. Same thing over here, Alt click, and Alt F will fill. By capping the piece off, if you do happen to leave one of these or use them, you can always just leave it hanging. You'll never have to look inside the geometry, and with backface culling, you would actually see through the object. Or if you wanted to use this object as some sort of an end piece where you expect there to be more pipe, we could go through and select the different objects, right click, and we could extrude along the normals, and we could go in a little bit. This way at least we could colorize the face, maybe darken it as it goes down to the center to at least make it seem like the pipe extends to infinity, even if it really doesn't. I'm going to leave one end this way and another end that way, so I have both options, and a smart level layout person will be able to rotate this pipe to pretty much fit any condition they want. Once again, we should name this thing, so let's call this pipe_bend. And I'm also going to give this a material, new, and we'll call this pipe bend_M. The next thing I want to think about is the placement of the origin. Right now, it's kind of not even in this dead center of this pipe, and it really isn't helpful at all. I would like this origin to be on one of these two ends, probably this one, because this one's got that little bit of an inset. The idea being that by having the pivot here, when I rotate, so if I rotate 90 degrees, it will pivot about that end point. In addition, by default, if I use a grid properly, it will snap along the grid. And so long as I keep with some sort of one unit convention, everything should line up perfectly. The easiest way is just to add some geometry that we soon delete afterwards. Go to edit mode, hit 1, select this vertex and that vertex, and then we can right click and we can do connect. This will create a line through this. By having that line, we can then use snapping. If we go to edge center, for instance, and we hold down shift and right click so that our 3D cursor goes to that location, as you can see there. Now, one way we can do this is just by selecting the object, going to object, and then doing set origin and choosing origin to 3D cursor. As you can see, it moved there. Another way is by going to tool and under transform, affect origins. This actually has a very nice hotkey, control and period. So if I hit control and period, what we'll notice is we get an interactive gizmo now on the pivot point instead. Now if I right click and move my pivot point to that location, you'll notice that I can actually adaptively update my pivot. So in this case, I'm going to move it over here. And many times it's better to have a wireframe. So I'm going to turn on my wireframe, and all I need to do is move this over here. Once again, control period will turn that off. So now we have our pivot in a somewhat convenient place. The only other thing we might want to think about is overall orientation. So if we rotate this, this is actually Z up here, which will become Y up for us. And then this would be our forward vector, and this is our right angle. So when we manipulate this object in Unity, it's going to look something like this. Now, I do like moving things to their origin, so I'm going to go to Item and just zero this out. In addition, because piping is usually put up against a wall, I'm probably going to want to rotate this either facing down or up. So let's go ahead and hit R for rotate, and then of course we can just rotate this to the position we like, and I'm going to choose a -90. Now, one thing we're going to do that's a little bit different is we're going to create both a high poly and a low poly version of this pipe. Now, before I do that, I do have a tiny bit of cleanup. You'll notice I have some weirdness going on. I seem to have a double, almost, well, not double, but two edges very close to each other here, whereas on this side I've got two, but they're kind of far away. This geometry really does nothing for me. So if we go to edit mode, hit 2, hold down Alt, we have this line here, and we can of course choose to destroy one of these. Hold down Alt, click, and then hit delete, and I'm just going to dissolve those edges. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to do a similar thing to, let's say, that edge. Delete and dissolve. Now what I would like to do is create a high poly version of this, but I'm not going to create the entire thing from the beginning. Instead, I'm going to use this mesh to create the higher resolution version. Similar to the Bezier curve we saw before, what's going to happen is all the vertices of the object are going to become the control points. To do this, I'm actually going to duplicate this object first. So let's go to the object, going to hit Control C, Control V, and we now have another pipe bend object. Let's name this different. I'm going to do pipe bend underscore high this time for high resolution. The original pipe bend, I'm just going to turn off for a moment. If we come over to our modifier tab and go to add modifier, we can choose subdivision surface. What you're going to immediately notice is our object looks smoother. The vertices become the points that it uses to smoothly interpolate over the surface. Because of that, we can add additional edges and faces to this object to create new details that are going to help define the object. Here, where the objects curve in and curve out, you'll notice that they have a soft look to them. If we wanted to make that a harder edge, we can insert edge loops into the object. So really, the best way to see this is by, of course, hitting Tab. Now, when we do that, you'll notice we have the control mesh, or cage, or whatever you want to call it, but it's our original polygonal object. And inside of that is the approximation. You'll notice that the approximation never gets to the polygonal version. It's always within it. Therefore, we have to define additional geometry to refine how this looks. If we hit 2 to go to edge mode, and we right click, we'll want to use loop, cut, and slide. That's Control R. If we come over here and I hit Control R, you'll notice that this interactive tool pops up, and as I move around the scene, based upon what I move over, it tries to figure out how it's going to insert a loop there. Once you make that selection, you can then move it from side to side, and you'll see that as I approach that inner part of the mesh, it becomes tighter. So if I click there, and we hit Tab, and we use a better rendering system, say this one over here. There we are. what you'll notice is that this part now, this seam, this crease, is going to appear tighter than the ones elsewhere. And of course, you can go through and start using this to make your geometry look a little bit better. Because right now, this pipe looks very soft for what it should be. Same thing for up here. Now we can come in here and hit Control R again and then move this around to better define that. We hit Control R down here, select this part, and let's turn off snapping. And up there. Now, of course, if we hit Tab, you'll see that we have a very, very, very tight, almost looks like it's a pipe and then this cuff has been put over top of it. And inside of here, we're definitely going to need to give it some help. So let's go ahead and hit Control R and let's harden this surface a little bit. Now I'm going to let's go to an X-ray mode so I can see through it. And it does take some experience with being able to see through a double mesh and understanding which parts correspond to which one. Just give your mind some time to get used to the idea. Hit Control R, and we will choose this one. And you'll notice that as I move this from up and down, we get a shape that is much more tight, like the inside of that pipe. And here we're going to want to do a similar thing. Now, I'm using this ring tool here, or the insert edge loop, or whatever it's called in Blender. But you can also do something similar by using the bevel tool. So let's go ahead and select this edge, move this one a little bit closer to that edge, and yeah. And if we want to, we don't just have to make this smoother by adding additional polygons. We can also go on this object and start adding additional detail. So let's say that on the higher res version of this, what we want to do is let's hit 3, and maybe we'll select a few of these faces, maybe this one, and this one on the underside. We could right click and we could do a inset to make that go in a bit. And then we can right click and do a extrude along normals. And you'll notice that we can create sort of a pop in or pop out. I'll go popping in maybe, or maybe not. Let's try that again and see what it looks like. Maybe somewhere around there. Okay. I don't know why this would be a detail on a pipe, but it is. And we can hit Control R, choose this part, and then better define this piping. Here we are. There. Now you'll notice it's not doing anything for these corners. Once again, we're going to need to hit Control R and choose to create that detail. Control R, this part, and maybe down here. And once again, Control R on this part and over. And Control R and over. There we are. Okay, so now we've got some sort of a strange view hole on this side of the object. Perhaps this one. Now you'll notice I have a edge here on this one, but I don't on the other one. I'm going to hold down Alt, click on it, and then delete, dissolve edge, and that disappears. Really wasn't adding anything anyway. And we can come in here and just start modeling as we would with anything. Grab some different parts, right click, inset them as well a little bit, just create some weird details. And then maybe these parts come out, so right click and extrude, and then we can pop that out a tiny bit. Now, one thing's important is I need to keep these details close to the surface, unless I want to go back and modify my polygonal mesh. It's got to be within a certain distance for the ability to project it from a high res to a low res to be easily obtainable. There are always ways around it, but when you're just starting off, try to keep these details, minor details, close to the surface that don't require additional extrusions or more detail to be added. Now that I have that, of course, there's nothing saying we couldn't right click and inset this a little bit, and that will help to better define that piece, right? Something like that maybe. And then we can come over here and hit Control R and then add this piece over here and then just continue over and over and over again to add the necessary detail. Now you'll notice that that extended all the way up the object. You might not want that. So here we are. Now we have some interesting surfaces. And of course, if we increase the levels in the viewport to something like 2, you'll see that this becomes sort of a rounded little bit on the end of this. And if I wanted that bottom to be a little bit more defined, there's nothing stopping me from grabbing that and doing so. Control R here and over there. Great. So now I'm going to commit this. Now this isn't something you have to do, but I usually like to get everything set up and don't rely on the exporter to do it for me. I'm going to go to Modifier Properties, and we have Subdivision here. Now if we click on that, we can hit Apply. If I hit Apply now, I lose that modifier, and what I really have is a high polygon version of that object. Let's go ahead and unwrap this particular pipe. So let's go to UV editing mode, select our pipe, go to Tab for Edit, hit A if you want to see everything in one shot, or if you'd like to, you can also turn on this mode that allows you to sync these two objects and make selections over here that show up on this side. Now that I have this object, I'm going to follow my typical workflow, which is just to reset all the UVs. So I'm going to come here and go to UV and just project from view. Just going to move this off the screen. And now I'm going to start inserting my seams. So of course I'm going to have a seam here. So let's Alt click that, and I'll alt click here. And all of these are good candidates for seams. They're inside the geometry. They're going to be hard to see or possibly notice. Also, we're going to do probably this entire one right here. You'll notice that because of the triangulation, it's having a harder time understanding how to do the edge loop or edge ring operations. And usually you want to try to work with quads as much as possible. Quads are much better for algorithms to traverse than triangle versions. And let's do one right there. Now that we have that, we can right click and mark a seam. Of course, we come over here now, hit A, and hit U for unwrap. And now what we need to do is figure out where our seam is going to go down the pipe. Now, I'm probably going to put it either on the inside or the outside of the object. The inside or the outside is where things are either compressing or being stretched as far as our UV space goes. So I'm going to hold down Alt and click here, and that's going to grab this entire ring. Now, some parts of these might not be needed, like this one right here. So I'm going to get rid of that one. I'm not sure that that's good to split that. And this one comes down and goes into here. So I think I'm going to get rid of that as well. And this one too. That one, and that's fine. So coming back over here, let's right click and mark seam. Let's come back over here, hit A and hit U to unwrap everything. And we can see that some parts are just fine. If I hit L and then G, that's going to do that. So let's make sure we come over here, and I'm going to hit L and now G. You'll notice that if I was in edge mode, selecting this would also select these other edges. However, when I move to face mode now and made my selection and use G, we're not messing with components that are shared. Now, let's see this one, L, G, move this over here. That's fine for in there. And then we can start looking at these other pieces and seeing, oh, what's more or less going on with them. So if we hit L and move this over here, we'll see it's this piece here. This looks like a prime piece that can be better laid out. One operation I kind of really like doing is working with pins. If we go to 1 for vertex mode, and I click on this one and I right click, I can actually pin a point. You'll notice I have 2 points on this object pinned. All right, I'm going to come up to UV. I'm going to turn on live unwrap. I'm going to hit G again. And the cool thing about live unwrap is it's constantly re-unwrapping the surface as I move it around, which means if I pin 2 points, I can use one to pivot about the other. This one's moving, this one's pinned, everyone else comes along for the ride, and the unwrap algorithm, every time I move it, is also updating so that I get this ability to pin it and then rotate it. All right, so why don't we, so let's grab all of these points here. All right, let's right click on that. And let's just go ahead and do a line along the x-axis. So it flattens all of them out, right? I'm going to right click and I'm going to pin them as well. I'm going to grab this point. I'm going to hit G. And we have that interactive update again. And check out what I'm able to do. Do you see what's happening? Since those points are pinned, they're not moving anywhere. They're stuck. Hit G. I can adaptively move this. Pinning takes a little bit more time to get used to, right? So I had to know that by binding these points and not allowing them to float, these ones are free to rotate. So this is sort of my spine or my backbone, if you will. And these other ones are moving based upon how these ones are updating. But the great thing about pins is it allows you to easily move objects around. And we could take this even further if we wanted to. You could, for instance, grab all the points on this side. We could, once again, let's do a auto align on the x-axis, and let's go ahead and pin these as well. And let's just grab something and move it around, right? So we grab those, and that's what happened. Let's grab all of these and interactively move them. Well, check that out. And as you do this, you can kind of get a sense of where you might have tension building up in your object. Now, that might sound weird, but it is a real thing. I can grab all these. We could go to UVs, and even though this is technically going to cause distortions, when I'm painting on this object, having these as straight as possible and lined up with the grid, the pixel grid, will make my life better. Now another thing we can do with having these pinned is we can use proportional editing. That's this little box in the center up here. If you turn it on by clicking on this and then choosing the fall off influence, that is the center point where you click is the middle, this is the fall off as you get to the edges. You could choose, for instance, smooth, grab a point here, maybe these three together, and hit G, and now what you'll notice is that the nearby ones move, but ever so slightly. The great thing about this is we can slowly make changes across the mesh, little by little, updating everything in line. Now take your time and lay it out however you see fit, and if necessary, cut them into additional segments. If you notice segments that literally span from top to bottom, those are usually the limiting UVs you have. They're so long that in order to keep a 1-to-1 ratio with any other object, everything else has to be scaled down so that it can fit into the 0-to-1 space. If you do see that, if you have one object like that but everything else isn't, consider cutting that in half or more, and you'll notice it's able to better lay things out. So let's see what a layout would actually look like. We select everything and go to UV. I'm going to do a average islands. This is going to rescale them so that their scales are 1-to-1. Then we're going to go to UV and then pack islands. And this is sort of the layout we're dealing with right now. Not the best. Let's turn off proportions and hit G, and you'll notice I can break these pieces off. All right. If I break enough of them apart, we can try something else and see if it works. G, and we'll do this last one over here. G. Great. Oh, we have one more. G. All right. Now we can select everything, UV, and pack islands. Open this up. We want to, of course, increase our margin. They're way too close together right now. And that's a good amount of space. It might be too much. Let's try 1.5. Still a bit much, so maybe just 1. That's not so bad. Now you could easily come in here and move these around and easily scale them up a good bit. And with UVs, it's all about how much time you want to spend with it. There's automatic techniques. We could do this from different projections or planes. You could try using cylinders, but at some point you do have to say I'm done. And for right now, that's where I'm at. So now that you've seen me go through this process, I'm going to very quick create the other pieces of pipe, and I'll speed that up, and then we'll export everything for Substance Painter. Now that we have 2 pipes finished, we can go ahead and if we want to turn them all on and do some final sanity checks. Now it looks like this 90-degree bend has a z-axis going this way, and that's actually not what I want. So what I'm going to do is select those 2, go ahead and hit R, and going to hold down Control and snap this to 90 degrees. There we are. Now I want to apply all my transformations. Go ahead and hit Control A, and I will apply everything. Of course, I'll remember to save my scene. Now we should do a sanity check on our pivots really fast, and if we take a look, it looks like both pivots for both objects are there at the center of the world. They're both facing down the same axis, and their axes should all be in the same directions. We're going to go ahead and export 4 files out. I'm going to export one for the pipe, the high poly, the pipe bend, and then the pipe high bend. Select your 3D object, go to File, Export, FBX. The first one I'll call pipe_2. I'll do selected objects only, and I will apply transform. Under geometry, normals, and I'll choose tangent space. Now one other thing I really should do before I move forward is on my pipe object, go to modifier, add modifier, triangulate. Same thing for pipe bend, modifier, triangulate. And then under the advanced options, I not only want tangent space, but I also want to apply that modifier to the object. Go ahead and hit export. Let's go to pipe 2 high, file, export, FBX. This one will be pipe2_high, and we'll hit export. File, export, FBX, pipe bend. Export, and finally, pipe bend high. We're going to real quick load the files into Substance Painter just to make sure we didn't export things improperly. So I'm going to go to File, New, Select, and I'll choose Pipe 2 FBX, OpenGL, and hit OK. Just do a fast sanity check, make sure things look okay, and File, New, Select, and this time we'll choose Pipe Bend. All right, both of our objects seem fine. 3D modeling, and we can hand this asset over to the person who is about to do the substance painting, which we'll cover in the next video.